Hello and welcome to Retech, and today we're going to talk about cameras. I know it's not our usual kind of subject video on this channel, but there's a very good reason for it, because a lot of these cameras are quite old now, and they can be considered as retro. But where do you draw the line with retro? How old does something have to be before it becomes vintage, classic or retro? And how useful is it still when it crosses that line into vintage or retro equipment? So today we're going to discuss some of these cameras and why I think it relates to the general classic computer scene and vintage computer scene. And one of the biggest thing is because some of these cameras have been around since the late 1990s and early 2000s. Now, a late 1990s camera is definitely in the vintage range because it's getting on for 22, 23 or 24 years old now. And even if you look at some of the later models in the early 2000s, they are over 20 years old. Here is a kind of a gaggle of cameras ranging from early to modern to very useful to not so useful, okay? And it's kind of, where do we really start in making out that these aren't going to be any good for kind of modern use or for use in general? Now, if we take a digital camera from the very early 1990s or early to mid 1990s, they started to become a little bit more popular. They weren't mainstream. They had a very poor resolution, but if you wanted to print out some decent photographs to keep in your family albums, etc., they weren't very good. But it was only a few years after that point, sort of in the early 2000s, that digital cameras started to become into their own. They started to make sense. And from that point onwards, we've seen an explosion of cameras. And we've seen an explosion of camcorders, all based around the digital technology. Now, all of these are digital cameras. The one which I consider is not particularly useful today is this little Vivitar one from around about 2004. I mean, it works well, but interfacing this and getting it to work with modern computer software and modern operating systems is a bit of a pain. And to be honest, the video quality isn't that great. Okay, so really it's more now of a kind of a retro and a history piece than anything else. But that aside, the rest of these are completely usable, and they are more than usable today as an everyday item, an everyday camera, a workhorse, something to take your snapshots with or your videos with. And so let me explain that a little bit further. Now, one of the oldest cameras here, or rather one of the lowest resolution cameras here, is this Minolta. It's just over 2.5 megapixels, and it's a very nice looking camera. And you might think, it's only 2.5 megapixels. Why is that ever going to be useful today? Well, they are much more relevant than you actually think they are. Even this Pentax, it's an Optio. It's about 5 megapixels. It's a nice little camera with an aluminium body on it. It's very, very well built. And I actually bought this in a 2005 or 2004 in a mall in Florida, and basically the reason I bought it is because my camera, I actually left it in my pocket. I had combats on at the time, and I leant up against a table, and because it was in my trouser pocket halfway up, it actually pushed against the metalwork on the table and it broke the screen. So I thought, well, I need another camera, so I decided to get this Pentax Optio, and it's been a very, very reliable and a very, very good camera. To be honest, it hasn't seen that much work, but you know, it's still good. It still works really well, and I wouldn't have an issue using either of these cameras to take pictures on and to put them in an album or put them online digitally and so on. And you know, the resolution of both of these cameras is more than enough for the type of everyday photographs that you would ever want to do. Now, as we move up a little bit, we get into the range of things like this Olympus camera, right? This is a little bit higher in megapixels. It's 7.1. You know, it's a step up from the Optio, and it's a step up massively from the Minolta, but not in the ways that you would think, which we'll come to in a moment. And it's a very nice camera with a power zoom on it, very big screen for the time, and it's really nice to use and to get on with. It's a very good camera optically. Now, as we move through the ranges, you're probably thinking, well, these are all a bit, you know, a bit low on megapixels, and you know, no way can they compete with modern cameras. Well, I have a FinePix camera here, which is about, I think this one's about 18 megapixels, no, 16 megapixels, sorry. And again, it has a power zoom. It's kind of almost a bridge camera, a very large screen on it. It does high quality HD video, and again, it's a very, very decent camera, and you know, you wouldn't be ashamed of using that for high quality photographs. And then we move on to the more modern side of it. Okay, we have a couple of bridge cameras with telephoto lenses on them, and these are getting into the higher megapixel range, including this one here. Again, telephoto bridge camera, very good on video, you know, with around the 20 megapixel mark on a couple of these cameras. These two of them are around about the 16 megapixel mark, and the larger one's a 20 megapixel camera. And you think, oh, that's much better. It's kind of the amount of pixels and megapixels that I would be looking for to take decent photographs. Well, what if I said that this mobile phone is 108 megapixels? It's a 108 megapixel camera on that phone, and it trumps all of the SLRs, all of the bridge cameras that are out there in pure megapixels. But this phone is not one I would use to take really good quality pictures. I would rather use a lower megapixel camera, such as this Olympus. Remember, it's only 7.1 megapixels. Or even for general photography, this 5 megapixel Optio. Or even in certain circumstances, this very lightweight Minolta camera with what would be regarded as a very poor pixel quality. And I know you're going to think, well, you're mad, you're a little bit insane, rather than using a modern smartphone with 100 plus megapixels over something that even maxes out on the bigger cameras here at 20 megapixels. And some people would kind of agree with that. They would think I was a bit crazy using one of these cameras. But I'm not actually, because that's megapixel size is not the be-all and end-all of cameras. If I take this piece of paper here, which is about 2.5 to 3 times the size of a large sensor in a bridge camera or a DSLR, and I say to you, I want you to take a pen and put 1.5 million pixels or dots on this piece of paper. Now, most of you would think that A, that would take a long time, and B, it would probably overrun this piece of paper. Then if I say to you, I want you to take this piece of paper, which is roughly the same size as a standard photograph that used to get developed, and I would say, I want you to put 1.5 million pixels or dots on this piece of paper. And again, you would probably think, I'm going to overrun this piece of paper. And you know, you would be correct. It would take a long time, and there would probably not be enough space for the amount of dots that you want to put on this piece of paper. Now, that is the minimum megapixel size that a photograph this size would need to be of good quality. Now, you would probably aim for the 2 megapixel mark just to be on the safe side, but 1.5 megapixels would actually give you a good image. So if we take a look at this chart here, if we look at the bottom left, you'll see a standard 6 by 4 inch photograph would use 2.16 megapixels. Not a lot really, and the consensus is anything from 1.5 million pixels upwards should be okay for a standard print of this size. Now, as you go up a little bit, 12 by 8 inch, which is getting, you know, reasonably large, you know, the recommended is 8.64 megapixels. Now, for 18 by 12 inch size pictures, you're looking at 19.44 megapixels roughly. Now, very few people on personal use will print anything out this large, and you know, even studios where they do albums and wedding photography and you know, kind of all that kind of related stuff don't get anywhere near this kind of size normally. Now, as we bump up, we're looking at 24 by 16, we're looking at 34.56 megapixels, and above that we can go all the way up to 36 by 24 inch, which is 77.76 megapixels. Now, you might think, well, why do I need a camera of 77 megapixels and above? Because I'm never going to print anything out which is 36 by 24 inch. Plus, I'm also restricted by the printers that I have, because most printers aren't that big. So if you've got 8, 9 or 10 megapixels on a camera, then you're overdoing it for an image that size. And if you've got 8, 9 or 10 megapixels on a camera which uses a sensor half or less the size of that, you're definitely overdoing it on the size of the sensor. Now, if you take a mobile phone and you take the average sensor size of a decent quality DSLR, that or smaller, okay, just out of scale, and then you try and cram that into a mobile phone, so you keep on folding and making it smaller and smaller, and then try and cram 108 megapixels onto there, you can now kind of see the problem. You are overrunning the sensor with megapixels, which means that you're not going to get the resolution that you would require from such a high amount of megapixels on a camera. That means that the image quality suffers. You see, even according to a well-respected photographic website, this comes to the same conclusion. When viewed up close a smartphone image falls apart. And this review was done in 2021, sort of mid 2021. And basically it says the number of megapixels you have will dictate the size of your photograph. On the other hand, resolution is the level of detail captured in your image, and that's what you should be looking for. You know, for example, a 6 megapixel Nikon D40 captures more detail than a 16 megapixel iPhone. And you know, that is largely true, because again, you've got to think of how big a sensor you can actually physically fit in a phone. And I agree here. So while the number of megapixels suggests I can create big prints with an iPhone, its real world resolution is not sufficient to do so. So really, if you need to print out something large or something detailed, a smartphone isn't quite the way to go. And the thing is, I also agree with this article where it says overcrowding small sensors with megapixel becomes destructive to the image quality. But you know, you're kind of looking at high pixel counts to sell the smartphone in a brochure, and this is basically where people are coming from when they're trying to sell their wares, and where people who are kind of getting into it for the first time or want a decent camera on the smartphone get a little confused, because megapixels is the only thing that really gets quoted. Now, based on the restrictions of a home printer or even a studio printer, A4 is going to be kind of the biggest size that most people will print out. It kind of restricts really the number of megapixels anyway that you actually need. And really, a 3 megapixel camera is going to be more than enough for most situations. Now, if you have a sensor that's overrun, you are actually restricting the amount of usefulness those pixels can actually be. You're actually restricting the amount of light that sensor is able to deal with, because it's so small and so packed. You see here is a good representation of image sensors. Now, if you want to get 20 million pixels on a 23.6 millimeter by 15.6 millimeter area, as in sensor, that's quite a big ask to get everything on here. Now, if you work it down to smartphones and you start dropping the sensor size to fit the smartphone, and you're trying to get the same amount of pixels on there, well, look at how much or how less room you have on each sensor. Now that affects the resolution. This, with less megapixels, will have a better resolution than this sensor with twice as much megapixels, or twice as many megapixels. And then the same goes for this one. So that's why you find that dedicated video cameras are always much better than a smartphone, and dedicated DSLRs or bridge cameras, or even dedicated compact cameras, are always much better than a smartphone when it comes to resolution. And all of these factors actually have a bearing on how good an image it is. Megapixels is one of these things that you look at in a brochure and you think, oh, 108 megapixels, it must be fantastic. Well, no, it's not always the case. So if I was kind of picking a camera for everyday use and something I want to chuck in my pocket, well, this has got a decent quality image on it at 5-ish megapixels, I think 5.1. If I wanted something that would do probably a really good picture all the way through, and it has a good lens on it, and it has a decent sensor on it, well, this Olympus 7.1 megapixels would be more than adequate, and I would get a very good picture out of this. And if I really wanted to push the boat out, I would pick one of these bridge cameras, again with a motorized zoom on it, etc., big screen, and running at about 16 megapixels, which is going to be more than enough for anything that I actually need. But if, like most of us, if you're not printing pictures out to put in an album or a frame or whatever you want to do, or even to display on your TV as a carousel of photographs for your family, or even a digital photo frame, etc., then you're going to be using them on social media and some media platforms, and they have restrictions for file sizes. So really, to be honest, a camera that's pushing about 2 to 3 megapixels is going to produce an image that's good enough for social media. You got to remember that the file sizes are restricted and the image is compressed, so you're going to lose quality anyway. The only way you're going to benefit from having larger numbers of megapixels, a bigger sensor to cope with it, is for you to actually print them out in physical form, or if you want to cut and crop a lot of your photographs for things that are massively in the distance, etc., where really you're going to need those extra pixels just to kind of take off the rough edges when you zoom right in, maybe at half a mile down the road, etc., in your photograph. And that's really the biggest advantage. But a mobile phone won't cut that, because the sensors are too small. Okay, they're much smaller, so you're lacking the light and the resolution when things are actually zoomed in using a digital zoom. Remember, all of these cameras here are not digital zooms, they're optical zooms. They physically alter the lenses to get your zoom, and that improves quality as well. So again, don't think that megapixels, especially on a smartphone, etc., is the be all and end all. Now, all of these cameras are completely useful, but what you're going to ask is, what about video? Well, what kind of video do you want to take? If you want to do video for kind of home movies and you want to be able to send it, you know, to your friends, etc., over the internet, or maybe you want to do some social media or YouTube stuff, well, most people will work in high definition, and so you're looking at kind of HD or 2K is what a lot of people call it, at 1080p, 1080i. Now, you're only looking at a sensor of 2 megapixels for that, and you might think, well, that's a bit low, but it's not. Again, just pop 2 million dots on this piece of paper, see how long it takes and how much space it takes up. Now, again, on a smartphone, they'll deal with high def quite easily. 2 megapixels, not a problem, but you're going to lose quality again through the size of the sensors when you start zooming in. Now, here is a semi-professional 1080i camera. It's got a Carl Zeiss lens, 3CCD, it's got very good optics on it and very good sensor. This in high def will be 1,000,000 times better zoomed right in on its optical lenses than your digital zoom on your smartphone. And because it has a bigger sensor overall in this camera, it will bring in a lot more light and things will look just that little bit more vibrant as well. And also, you won't get the blurring and tracking issues that you do on some mobile phones, because the sensor really can't cope with it. And again, megapixels don't really count. It's the sensor and the actual quality of the camera. There's no way you can get the quality of the sensors and the optics that go into something like this into something as small or smaller than a smartphone with its very small array of cameras lenses on the back. Okay, so yeah, video isn't as intensive as taking your still photograph, which a lot of people kind of don't believe it is. They think that video is more intensive on the sensor than photography, but it's not. A still, because of the level of detail you want, is more intensive on both the hardware and the sensor. But 4K video requires an 8 megapixel sensor, and you only really need 2 megapixels to capture full HD for 1080p video. Now, it doesn't sound a lot, does it? But you have to remember that even 4K at 8 megapixels, it takes up a lot of processing power and a lot of bandwidth, really, if you piping that down as social media streams such as YouTube or whatever platform you're using. Even 2 megapixels is a lot of information to kind of pump down a broadband connection or stream from a server or a service. You see, video doesn't need anywhere near as much kind of detail as a standard photograph, a standard picture, something that you want the level of detail to be high when you physically pick it up if you've printed it out and look at it. You may also want to crop the image, so again, you need that extra bit of detail that you don't really need on video. You got to remember that most people will watch streaming or videos on a smartphone screen or a tablet screen, and a lot of these services are limited to standard definition, and you wouldn't really see any difference on a smartphone screen because of the physical size of the screen. So you got to ask, why do we continuously upgrade? Even broadcast companies don't put out a lot of content in 4K, because when they do, it's not quite 4K anyway, because it's compressed, because it's got to be able to be streamed. And you've got to think of the bandwidth of the average broadband connection, and it's got to be able to cope with it. So most broadcast companies broadcast in 1080i or standard definition. So at the end of the day, it's not all about megapixels. So to come back to my point originally, is when does technology cross the line? When does it become vintage? And when does it stop being useful? Well, it all depends. You see, a computer of the late 90s, early 2000s would struggle to process an image from this little camera from 2004. But it would be okay with an image from this Minolta from 2000-ish to 2002. And it would be fine with that, and it would process the image quite well. Now, you start moving up to 7.2 to above 14, so you're looking around 16 megapixels or so, and then you move up to the 20 megapixel range, etc. There's no way an early PC will cope with that properly. They just don't have the facilities and the memory and even the processing power in some cases to be able to cope with images of that specification, and the same goes for video. But in overall terms of usefulness, 99% of these cameras are still completely, fully useful today. And that's the thing. Just because it's a little older in technology doesn't mean it doesn't have a use today. And I believe we are actually disposing of things that are completely serviceable and useful, just on the back of what we would call marketing blurb. At the end of the day, if you took a photograph with any of these, including the smaller pixel cameras, and you printed it out normal photograph size that you would do when you had film camera, and you popped it in your album, nobody would know the difference. You wouldn't be able to tell. And that's the nice thing about some forms of technology. And it's also a good thing to use rather than to pop them in the recycling bin or down your local waste management services or in landfill. And at the end of the day, most cameras don't get a massive amount of use. Even this little Olympus has very low usage, and that's one of the things I can't quite get my head around, because we're basing everything on marketing blurb. If I wanted to do these videos on a smartphone, I could do them on a smartphone at 4K, and they would look fine. They would come across really good. They wouldn't have the sound quality, because that's how I started on my videos, with just a standard smartphone that could run 1080p or 4K, and you'd use the facilities that were on it. And to be honest, it wasn't very good. I got myself a studio quality camera. Technically, if you look down the specs, it's nowhere near what my first smartphone was that I was using to do these channels in terms of spec, and it's not even a patch on the overall specification of this camera. But the quality it produces is infinitely better because it was designed as a video camera. I could have used one of these, a bridge camera or an SLR, one of my SLRs, and just set it to record at 1080 or 4K, and it would record 30 minutes ago, because that's the restriction on recording that these type of cameras have, because they're not designated as video cameras. So that would have restricted me to the length and the actual type of filming I could do. The quality would have been nice because it was a bridge camera or an SLR with a decent lens on and a decent sensor, but again, it's not designed as a video camera. It doesn't have XLR inputs, it doesn't have external mic inputs and so on. And you have to think about what you're going to use your kit for, and then buy it and use it accordingly. So if you get a classic or vintage camera from the sort of early-ish 2000s onwards, you'll find them very useful. You might find them a little slower on the shutter speed than a modern camera, but they will almost certainly do what you need them to do on a daily basis. And also, you might have a bit of fun, because some of the features on more modern cameras are kind of missing from some of the early cameras, which that's all part of the process of enjoying technology. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you kind of get a different perspective on what is useful, what is good technology, what is not any good anymore, what you can use on a daily basis, and what you might want to avoid on a daily basis. So not everything that's more than a year old is completely out of date, too old to use, or useless. That's not really the case. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you soon for more takes on vintage and classic computer technology. Thanks a lot.